Hello. If you are new to this series, my name is Tony Mays, and I am the Education Specialist for Open Schooling at the Commonwealth of Learning. This is the 9th of 11 presentations, each of which summarizes the key issues in different chapters of Cole's new publication addressing the needs of out-of-school children and youths through expansion of open schooling. This presentation reflects on Chapter 9, Policy and Open Schooling. In Chapter 9, we conclude Part A of the book by exploring policy issues. The discussion is, as usual, organized around 5 key questions. What are the key conceptual and contextual issues for policy? What is the nature of policy? What are the key issues for ODL policy? What should ODL policy address? And what are the implications for future open schooling provision? So let us start with the first question, which explores key underpinning conceptual and contextual issues. Distance education, emphasizing issues related to space, time, and transaction, led to open distance learning, ODL, open approaches, distance methods, and an emphasis on the learning process over content transmission. Then technology enabled, which can happen on campus, also changed things, and e-learning is now increasingly embraced by ODL to make ODEL provision. And this is not necessarily fully online provision. The diagram illustrates a grid of possibilities for degrees of teleintegration, which was developed by SAIDI, an NGO in South Africa. As can be seen from the grid, there are a range of possibilities for mode of provision. And these may include, for example, an offline program offered to widely distributed students, but including some digital support, such as podcasts and videos loaded onto a tablet or flash drive. A part-time program with face-to-face contact support offered in several satellite centers, some digital resources, and optional online discussion forums. A large classroom-based program offered on the main school campus, as well as on a variety of satellite school campuses. A fully online program offered to students all over the world. A fully online program that students access in computer labs or by using their own devices in Wi-Fi hotspots on campus. There is a need to design a learning model that is appropriate for the learning purpose, the student's needs and expectations, and the context or contexts in which the learning will happen. This example shows the decisions made regarding the learning model underpinning a B.Ed Honours program offered to in-service teachers through a unit for distance education at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. You can see that on the right-hand side that the underpinning design, based upon the literature and upon policy expectations, was to move the emphasis from student engagement with staff towards independent and student-student engagement with content in individual and group activities. In the middle, you can see that during the course of the program, the B.Ed Honours staff would be collecting data on students' engagement through learning analytics, and then following up by email or e-tutors, SMS, or through a call center, depending on where learners began to drop out of the system or to slow down. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see we start with continuous enrollment. After enrolling, students have opportunity to get ICT and e-library training. Then they receive some printed materials and have an option to attend a face-to-face orientation session. After the orientation session, the online course for that particular block opens in the LMS, and students are encouraged to work through and supported to work through Units 1 and 2, which has introductory, developmental and consolidating activities that feed into the development of Assignment 1. After completing assignment 1 and getting feedback, they continue in their studies with units 3 to 6, sometimes 7 units, again with introductory, developmental and consolidating activities that feed into assignment 2. Towards the end of the program, they have another opportunity to attend an optional face-to-face consolidating meeting, and then there's some online semi-structured to open engagement and discussion that follows that before the learners make a decision about whether they want to sit the examinations or whatever summative assessment is required, or roll over and delay the assessment to the next cycle. The thinking underpinning this approach is that everything should be driven by the program's intended outcomes, which are broken down into module outcomes, and that formative evaluation is a key part of the teaching process. Multiple business models arise from different purposes and different contexts. We introduced this notion in the discussion on finances, and here we have an elaborated example where we have identified key partners, key activities, key resources, the value proposition that underpins the work of a particular institution, the customers, the channels and the customer segments that they're trying to reach out to, the cost structure, and then the revenue streams. So this is a building upon the discussion that we had in an earlier chapter. As we move from campus-based into ODL provision, some traditional issues still need to be addressed, but in different ways, but also some new issues arise, and some of the examples are listed here. So, what is the nature of a policy to govern all of those kinds of issues? Rizvi and Lingard in 2010 observed that there is no single agreement on what a policy is, or should be, or even how it should be constituted. But their review of the literature suggests that some important considerations for what a policy should address. It should indicate what the government chooses to do or not to do. It delineates a particular field of activity and the actions and positions taken in response to that. It's normative in the sense of providing guidelines for good practice. And it exercises or identifies the areas over which authority should be exercised. It's a text that can be debated, and often is, and evolves usually from a process where a draft policy document comes out for debate, a further revision comes out for further discussion before a final policy is put into place. But even that policy should be subject to ongoing modification. And as we try to implement it in practice, we sometimes see that the policy needs to be updated. So there's usually an ongoing discourse or discussion, and the policy itself relates to other policies. So particularly an ODL policy will probably have relationship with the wider education sector policy, with ICT policies and so on. Increasingly, we are influenced by not only national developments and regional developments, but also global developments in education. So the policy has to address all of these ranges of issues. So what are the key issues for an ODL policy to enable an open schooling to work effectively? So a policy for ODL, as we have mentioned before, is really about trying to balance the issues of access, quality, and cost. So we want to increase capacity and the cost effectiveness of education provision to reach the groups in the population that we're not reaching using more traditional means. But we also want to make sure that what we offer is of high quality and relevant to learning needs. Globalization and the imperatives of the network society are affecting higher education almost everywhere in the world. Open and distance learning may be the only way of meeting future ever more complex and diversified student demands. In any case, open and distance learning are continuing to grow at a very fast pace. and the development of workable and relevant regulatory frameworks that are transparent and not overly bureaucratic are imperative to the success of open and distance learning and the realizations of its benefit for students and its contribution to the solution for mounting education pressures. A lot of university higher education has already moved to open distance and online learning, and there's a growing realization following COVID and other challenges that schooling also should embrace more distance learning and online learning. As noted in Chapter 6, the purposes, costs and cash flows for ODL provision are somewhat different from traditional campus-based provision, so the policy needs to provide guidelines on how open distance learning and open schools would be funded. Some key policy issues that need to be addressed is: why is the policy necessary? To what does it apply? To whom does it apply? Where does it apply? When does it apply? And how does it apply? And the policy will probably have sections like those illustrated. Once there is a national policy framework, institutions can begin crafting their institutional policies in alignment with the national policy. You'll note here, for example, in relation to a previous comment, a section on cross-border provision and how do we ensure that we offer equivalent learning experiences and opportunities if we're reaching out to students beyond our national borders. So, if we think about all of these policy issues, we think it would be useful, after you've read Chapter 9, to discuss the following kinds of questions. Is there a specific distance education or ODL or ODEL policy in your country? Are there existing examples of distance education, ODL or ODEL practice in your country? What existing policies and practices might support the implementation of open schooling? What existing policies and practices might impede the implementation of open schooling? And what can we do together to address any policy challenges? As with all COL resources, this presentation is available under a attribution share alike open license. We thank you for your time and we look forward to the discussions that will hopefully be provoked after you've read Chapter 9.